Okay, so have you ever looked at the moon and thought about how it's got those two total different sides, the light side and the dark
Yeah,
side?
like a yin and yang kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But what if I told you that that whole duality thing, that on and off flip, could be like a fundamental clue to understanding energy, like in a totally new way?
Hmm. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today on the deep dive. And we always start with the sources you send us, right?
Absolutely. Our listeners are the backbone of the show, always bringing us the most fascinating stuff to unpack.
This time, you've really outdone yourselves.
Okay.
We've got these excerpts, one titled Forståelse Fairy on Cyclic Energy Model, which, by the way, translates to Understanding a Cyclic Energy Model.
Catchy, right?
Super catchy. And then we've got this other one that's simply called Untitled 16.pdf, which just adds to the mystery,
Well, I love a good mystery.
So our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to really crack open what seems to be a very unique model of energy. They're calling it a cyclic energy model, and try to pull out the core ideas, the stuff that we think will really resonate with you.
And what's really cool about these sources is how they kind of blend together all these different ideas, like energy, mathematics, even a bit of philosophy in there.
It's not your typical textbook stuff.
Definitely not. And it's not just about adding another theory to the mix. These sources seem to be suggesting a totally new way of looking at how these things connect, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, like maybe a total rethink of how we usually see these things. All right, so let's get to it. The first thing that really jumped out at me was this whole moon analogy.
Oh, yeah, the moon thing is super interesting. It's like they're using the moon as a visual for this concept of duality. You've got that line right through the middle.
Splitting it in half.
Exactly. And that represents the binary, right? That invert, extrovert, the 1 and 0.
Light and dark, on and off.
But then you have the outer edge of the moon, which is this perfect circle representing the whole.
And what they really stress is that this isn't supposed to be some mathematical equation, but a direct observation of form, like how linear energy and circular energy can actually exist at the same time.
And this ties in perfectly with what Untitled 16.pdf calls the Polaritetsprincipen.
Yeah, what a principle.
Polaritetsprincipen. It's Swedish for polarity principle. And it basically says that everything, absolutely everything, has these interconnected opposites.
Okay, so like light and dark, hot and cold, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And they present this principle as the key to how anything can even come from nothing. Like, how can something pop into existence from, well, nothing? This principle seems to be their answer.
That is wild. So we start with nothing, but it's not just empty nothing. There's potential there.
Right. It's like this dormant potential waiting to be unleashed. And that's where the idea of absolute null comes in, which is their term for absolute zero, a state of pure nothingness. But again, it's not empty. It contains the potential for something.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get this. So you've got this back and forth between nothing and something, this 0 going to 1. And then they bring in this term alpha omega.
Yes. And alpha omega is that binary reality, the on and off, the most basic pulse of existence, like the universe switching on and off constantly.
And that's where they introduce this equation that kind of threw me for a loop.
Yeah.
1 plus 0, 1 equals 0. I mean, sure, mathematically that works out.
Yeah, but here's the catch. It's not just about adding and subtracting numbers. It's a symbolic way of showing three different systems all working together at the same time. The nothing, represented by the 0, the binary system of 1 and 0, and then what they call the primary, which starts at 3.
Okay, I think I need you to break that down for me a bit.
Think of it like this. Nothing is the starting point, that pure potential. Then you have the binary, which is the polarity principle, that dance between opposites that kicks things off. And then you get primary, the first level of actual manifestation.
Gotcha. So the primary is where things actually start to take shape. And that's where they introduce the idea of the quantum dot.
Yes, and this quantum dot is represented by the number 3. But 3 isn't just a random number here. It stands for the 3 simplest forms that energy can take on: a triangle, a square, and a circle.
Oh, I like that. It's visual.
Exactly. It's not about adding or subtracting anything. It's symbolic. And in Untitled 16.pdf, they call this the kvantmekaniska punkten, or quantum mechanical point, which they describe as the most basic form of energy. They even give it a fancy equation, but it's basically the seed of everything. And this seed has the potential to become one of these 3 basic shapes. Imagine a one-dimensional line forming a triangle, a two-dimensional plane making a square, and then that circle implying a 3-dimensional space.
Okay, so we've got this energy that can pop into existence and take on these basic forms. But how does it actually change between them? Like, how does a triangle become a circle, you know?
That's where they bring in electricity and circuits.
Oh, so they're not just talking about energy in a theoretical sense, but like actual electricity.
Exactly. They're suggesting that electricity and circuits are like the blueprints for energy itself. Think of electrical current, that flow of charge, as this perfect blend of linear and circular movement.
Right. The electricity is moving in a line, but it's also creating that magnetic field around it, which is circular.
You got it. And they see this linear and circular movement as the foundation for how energy expresses itself in all forms.
So it's like, if you want to understand how energy works, got to understand how electricity works.
Exactly. And they take it a step further, saying that electricity, with its linear current, and magnetism, with its circular field, are the mechanisms of energy transition. They're how energy changes from one form to another.
Okay, I'm following.
Wow.
So instead of thinking of energy as some mysterious force, we can look to electricity and magnetism to understand how it actually moves and changes.
Now you're getting it. And then they bring in the infinity symbol, the figure eight, but they're not using it in just a mathematical sense. They see it as a closed circuit, like a continuous loop where energy flows in this never-ending cycle.
So energy is always moving, always transforming, always in this loop.
That's the idea. Untitled16.pdf explains it in more technical terms, talking about ions and voltage and resistance. They describe how electricity, which is the flow of charge, combines with magnetism to form electromagnetism. They even say that electromagnetism is created by the fusion of these things: ions, voltage, current, and resistance in a state of polarity. And get this, all this leads to new forms, to manifestation. Pretty cool, huh?
That's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So this dance between electricity and magnetism, that interplay between the linear and the circular, it's not just some random phenomenon. It's the engine of creation. It's how things come into being.
Precisely. And remember that principle of polarity we talked about earlier? Well, they're saying that this interplay of electricity and magnetism is a direct reflection of that fundamental polarity, the constant push and pull between the one and the zero.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. It's like a big puzzle, and we're slowly putting the pieces in place.
Exactly. And speaking of pieces fitting together, they bring up Ohm's law, which is a pretty fundamental concept in electricity. VIIOT.R.
Vaguely. I remember seeing that in physics class somewhere. Refresh my memory.
Well, basically, it describes how electricity flows in a circuit based on voltage and resistance. But here's the interesting part. The sources draw a parallel between Ohm's law and consciousness, observation, and manifestation. They suggest a similar kind of relationship: energy, manifestation, x resistance.
Wait, hold on. Are they saying our minds are like electrical circuits?
It's more nuanced than that. They're suggesting that there's an analogy between how energy flows in a circuit and how our consciousness interacts with reality. So Ohm's law says that the flow of electricity is determined by the voltage, which is like the potential energy, and the resistance in the circuit. And the model suggests that our consciousness also works with potential energy, which it observes.
Okay, so we observe the potential energy. I can see that. What about the resistance part?
Well, they say that the resistance could be things like our own filters, our perceptions, our beliefs, our expectations, even our fears. And these things influence how that potential energy actually manifests in our lives.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this connects. It's like we're constantly tuning into this field of potential energy, but our own internal resistance shapes what we actually experience.
You got it. And what's mind-blowing is that this model is trying to bridge the physical and the non-physical. It's suggesting that the same laws that govern the flow of energy in the physical world might also apply to the realm of consciousness and how we create our reality.
Okay, deep breaths. This is a lot to take in, but it's also incredibly fascinating. Now, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I got to ask about this whole Fibonacci thing.
Yes. The golden ratio, 1.618, or as mathematicians like to call it, Favi. This is where things get a little counterintuitive.
Counterintuitive, how so?
Well, the model proposes that 1.618, the golden ratio, isn't the fundamental value. They say it's actually an approximation based on 1.5. And get this, they call 1.5 halva halva, which in Swedish means half of a half.
Halva halva. Okay, I like that. It sounds kind of like a magic spell. But seriously, how does half of a half lead to the golden ratio?
Well, they see 1.5 as this central measure, this golden rotation. And here's the math. 1.5 varv, which translates to 540 degrees, plus another 180 degrees, which they describe as splitting, gives us 720 degrees.
And that's two full circles.
Two full circles, which is the figure eight.
Yeah.
the infinity symbol.
You got it. So even in basic geometry, even in the way we measure rotations, they're finding this fundamental cyclic nature of energy. Okay, but how do the numbers 6 and 9 fit into all of this?
Well, the sources link 6 and 9 to clockwise and counterclockwise movements within this cyclical system. And remember, the figure 8, the infinity symbol, is the circuit connecting these opposing movements. They see 6 as representing a stable central point and 9 as an expansion outward from that point.
So it's like a cosmic dance between 6 and 9, with the figure 8 as the stage.
That's a great way to visualize it. And Untitled 16.pdf explicitly mentions this halva halva HH print spin and how 1.5, this half of a half, shows up as this approximation of the golden ratio, which is a key player in both linear and circular energy according to the model.
Okay, so halva halva 1.5, it's not just a number, it's like a fundamental concept in the system. But with all this talk of cycles and rotations and opposing forces, it makes me wonder, how does this whole system stay balanced? How does it not just spin out of control?
That's where they bring in the holographic fractal cube. Imagine a cube, right? But not just any cube. This one is multi-layered, kind of like a Russian nesting doll, with energy patterns repeating themselves at different scales.
Like it's a cube, but also kind of a fractal, repeating itself over and over.
Exactly. And this fractal structure is how they explain stability. They say the cube stabilizes through the balance between 2 times pi and the doubling of the alphabet.
Hold on. Pi as in pi, the mathematical constant. What does pi have to do with a cube?
Well, they see pi as going from half a circle, which is 180 degrees, to a whole circle, 360 degrees. And remember those figure eights. They say that 2 of them interlock, kind of like frequencies, and these frequencies can either dampen each other or amplify each other.
Okay, I'm trying to picture this. 2 figure eights interlocking like gears in a machine.
Perfect. And the sources claim that the value of phi, approx 0.0984, isn't just some random number, but a key part of this balancing act between these 2 circuits. And they say one circuit is for linear energy associated with numbers and having 6 cycles.
6 cycles. Just like the 6 sides of a cube. I see where they're going with this.
Right. And then the other circuit is for circular energy, and that's linked to the letters of the alphabet with 2 cycles. Untitled 16.pdf calls this whole structure the Selbststabilisierende Holografiske Fraktalkuben, which is a mouthful, but it basically means self-stabilizing holographic fractal cube. And they propose that the 6-dimensional cube is born from the interaction of linear energy, represented by the Fibonacci sequence, and circular energy, embodied by the golden ratio.
Okay, so this cube is like the ultimate balancing act, keeping the whole system stable. But you mentioned that numbers have 6 cycles and letters have 2. Where did they get those numbers from?
That's actually based on sequences they provide. You have the numbers 1 through 10 repeated 6 times, which gives you 60 numerical units, and then the letters A through which I think is the Swedish alphabet, repeated twice, which makes 56 letters.
So they're not just making these numbers up, they're drawing them from actual sequences. That's pretty wild.
It is. And the Verstelsver and cyclic energy model source hints that the 6 cycles for numbers are connected to the 6 dimensions of the cube, while the 2 cycles for letters, totaling 56, relate to the alphabet doubling itself in a circular circuit.
Okay, so numbers represent linear energy and are linked to the cube, while letters represent circular energy and are linked to this cyclical doubling.
Precisely. And then there's this whole concept of primtal splittering, or prime number splitting, like 9 becoming 99 and then 999. They see this as energy expanding, but not just in a normal way, but in a scale-independent way.
Scale-independent, meaning it can happen at any level.
Exactly. Each threshold, whether it's 999 or 999, marks a new level of energy manifestation. It's like this fractal process where the basic pattern repeats itself, but at bigger and bigger scales. Think of it like a tiny seed sprouting, growing into a plant, then a tree, then a whole forest. It's the same pattern unfolding, but on different levels.
Okay, so it's not about prime numbers in the usual mathematical sense, but about energy expanding and multiplying itself.
You got it. And Untitled 16.pdf backs this up by saying that numbers, the 0-9 cycle, and letters, the 28 non-cycling letters, are both symbols of energy, but with a 2-cycle difference between them. They also talk about energy balancing around a central point, like 5 on a 0-10 scale.
So there's this idea of balance that keeps popping up everywhere. And then there's this quantization at 999 and 999, which they say leads to exponential growth.
Exactly. It's like energy hits these key thresholds and then explodes outward, following this repeating fractal pattern.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but before we wrap up, we got to talk about pi. they seem to have a very specific interpretation of pi in this
Oh
model.
yes, pi. They approach it in a really interesting way. They suggest that pi, which is conceptually 3.14, starts with what they call a half 3 point A and is considered twice the diameter in their model.
Twice the diameter, so not the traditional ratio of circumference to
We
diameter.
got it. And the interesting thing is that when they double pi, going from 3.14 to conceptually 28, that number matches the 28 letters of the alphabet.
Hold on, so they're saying that pi, when doubled in this way, directly connects to the alphabet.
That seems to be the connection they're making. And then they look at the numbers. They talk about how the numbers going through those 6 cycles of 1.5, which equals 9 conceptually, and then doubling that 9, maybe representing the 2 halves of the figure 8, reach a conceptual 18, which they link to a broader cycle. They say that this creates a complete cycle, the figure 8 we've been talking about.
So the numbers and the letters are both woven into this cycle, this figure 8.
Exactly. And according to the model, this balancing act between the 28 letters and this conceptual 28 from pi, combined with the cyclical nature of the numbers, is how pi fits into this whole structure. They even suggest that this eliminates the irrationality of pi, at least within the context of this cyclic understanding.
So pi, which we usually think of as this irrational, never-ending number, suddenly becomes rational and integrated within this framework. Untitled16.pdf actually dives deeper into this. They say that pi is a symbol for both a half cycle and 2 whole diameters within the context of the figure 8, those 2 interlocking circles.
Right. They highlight the doubling of 3 to reach a conceptual 8, which represents a full cycle, and the doubling of 14 to get to 28, giving that relation of 288, which equals 3.5.
And of course, they bring back halva 1.5, saying it's not just a number, but a fundamental relation of balance. It's like this core principle of dividing things in half, which they see as a recurring theme throughout this whole energy system.
And, this model definitely isn't your typical mathematical or physics model.
Yeah, it's definitely something else.
It feels like a blend of numerology, physics, and philosophy all rolled into one. It's a very different way of looking at reality, that's for sure.
And, for me, that's what makes it so fascinating. Like this whole idea of pi, when doubled in this way, lining up with the alphabet at 28, while the numbers cycle and fit perfectly into this figure 8, it's just mind-blowing.
Right. It creates this really cohesive picture, even if it's not the picture we're used to seeing.
It's like they're using math and symbols to paint a picture of the universe.
Exactly. And it's a picture where everything is connected, everything is in balance, everything is flowing in these cycles.
It definitely stretches the boundaries of what we normally think of as math and science.
Yeah, it pushes you to think outside the box, to see things from a totally new angle.
Okay, so let's do a quick recap for our listeners. We started with the moon as a visual representation of duality, that fundamental concept of opposites. Then we explored this idea of halva 1.5 as the core principle and its connection to the golden ratio. And of course, we talked about the figure 8, the infinity symbol, as a representation of this cyclical flow of energy. We also looked at the interplay between linear and circular energy, symbolized by numbers and letters, and how they come together in this self-stabilizing, holographic fractal cube.
And who could forget pi? We dove into how the sources reinterpret pi as a double diameter, connecting it to the alphabet at 28 and integrating it into this broader cyclical structure.
And throughout all of this, we kept coming back to this idea of balance, of how everything in this model seems to be striving for equilibrium.
Right. It's like they're saying that balance is the key, the underlying principle that governs the entire universe.
And for you, our listener, I hope this deep dive has given you some fresh perspectives on energy and the fundamental structures of reality. Maybe it's even sparked some of those aha moments we were hoping for.
This model definitely pushes us to think outside our usual frameworks and to see connections where we might not have expected them.
It's a good reminder that even the most familiar things like the moon, numbers, or even pi can be seen in entirely new ways if we're open to exploring different perspectives. And that's what the deep dive is all about.
Exactly. We're all about exploring the unconventional, the thought-provoking, the mind-bending. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I have one final thought for you to ponder. Given how much this model emphasizes cycles and the principle of hava as a relation of balance, how might you see these concepts reflected in other areas that you're curious about? Are there other systems, other phenomena that might reveal hidden connections and deeper meanings if you view them through this lens of cyclical balance? Maybe there's a whole universe of unexpected insights waiting to be discovered simply by applying this new way of seeing.
So keep those minds open, keep exploring, and until next time, happy diving.